Yes, let's continue on with the dinosaur tracks found with human footprints also inside them. We looked yesterday at this website here under D, letter D, dinosaur tracks. Up here, dinosaur photos from the Paluxy River. Go to this website, take a look at it, and you can read it at your leisure. And I just went down here to the different trails. You can click on the different trails. Different people came at different times. There's a lot of people getting involved in this, and a lot of controversy too. People insist that this is a hoax, but there's just too much information. And they looked at one track, which they actually cut out of the rock bed of the Paluxy River, and looked at the toes themselves, and there were microscopic little prints, as if that would happen perfectly if you oozed your foot into the mud. There's little microscopic bubbles and impressions that could not be carved. So we're not looking at something that, here's where they have it, at Cretaceous limestone near Glen Rose, Texas. So, however, if those structures follow the contours of the impression, the carving theory would be falsified. Internal structures dramatically conform to the shape of both the heel impression and the great toe impression, demonstrating that this is an original impression in limestone well known for dinosaur prints. See, so let's go back to Bible study manuals. And we'll take a look at K33 is what the file is we're in. K33.htm. And we'll look at where we left off yesterday. Professor of Anthropology, University of Chicago, talks about this particular track that we just looked at. The layer that the Burdick track came from was found in False Branch, which is a tributary of the Paluxy River. We see here the front end of the track that we have sawed across. We just looked at that. The toe end is now set on the host rock. And we can see now those grape-sized calcite inclusions both in the host rock and at the bottom of the Burdick track rock. We also did pin sections of the host rock in the matrix from the track and found that they matched perfectly. And so we find that it was not isolated from a different area. Wasn't a hoax, and we know where it came from, the Paluxy River, that specific cutout that they took the time to saw out of that bedrock. In Lamb and Whitman's book on soil mechanics, we find diagrams that illustrate pressure structures that are formed when pressure is applied in a plastic medium. The structures that were in the Burdick track, a cross-section, were actually better than the actual ones they were able to form in the laboratory. We notice here in the illustration in the textbook, where the load is bearing down, the resulting structures go down and out, somewhat like a mustache. That's when you press your foot down in the mud. And you form a mustache with the toe. In this cross-section of the Burdick track toes, we notice directly under the second toe, especially concentrated under the inclusion, where pressure would have been concentrated. The pressure goes down and out and back up. And then we find, and then under the toe, next to the little toe, again we find a calcite inclusion. The pressure concentrate, and we find the mustache-type structure. And so again we find further confirmation this is not carved. It was caused by pressure, foot stepping in the mud inside the dinosaur track. But that's not all of the evidence we see at Glen Rose. We also see this cat track 9 inches across. This would have been a very, very large cat and a large mammal discovered at the same time as the dinosaurs would be just as devastating to the theory of evolution and to the picture presented by the geologic column. These animals and human prints are completely out of whack with the evolutionary theory, but most of the rock strata is out of whack with the textbooks. We see the 4 toes and the pad of the cat beautifully preserved in a fossil. You can look at that up at the website I showed. And so the response was, well, this one was carved too. We sawed it across one of the toes and noticed that this one did have the striations that were deformed by the pressure, proving again that this was not carved. And then we find this very dramatic fossil, a human finger. We see very clearly a fingernail type structure and joints indicated. A number of anatomists have been astounded at the precise anatomical detail that we see in this beautifully formed three-dimensional fossil. I actually saw that. Some have suggested that these three-dimensional fossils are so rare that you wouldn't expect to find such a fossil as this. And yet in Glen Rose we find all kinds of three-dimensional fossils. For example, fossils of hundreds of soft-bodied earthworms, completely three-dimensional. We decided to section this finger fossil, and we see the bone structure delineated from what would appear to be the flesh and the epidermis on the outer edges. And so added to the other fossils is this beautiful three-dimensional fossil finger. What a find. And then we find this amazing fossil further down toward London, Texas, near Fredericksburg. Again in the Cretaceous, but this time in sandstone. The iron hammer, which material proves out to be non-magnetic, suggesting that it was formed while the canopy over the Earth was intact, before the influence of outer space radiation. So what has been so far been found at Glen Rose completely falsifies the picture presented by the geologic column. Notice the statement made by Ernest Mayr of Harvard University, one of the more famous evolutionists of our time, in the Gish-Mayer debate in Evansville, Indiana. And he said, creationists have stated that humans and dinosaurs were contemporaries in time. Were this momentous statement true, the names of its discoverers would thunder down the corridors of time as individuals who made one of the most outstanding discoveries of the 20th century. Not so, because when you have a preponderance of people believing differently, they'll quash that. The implications are also seen clearly by Stephen Stanley, a prolific science writer, a paleontologist from Johns Hopkins University, in his recent book, The Evolutionary Timetable. He said there is an infinite variety of ways in which, since 1859, the general concept of evolution might have been demolished. Consider the fossil record, a little-known resource in Darwin's day. The unequivocal discovery of a fossil population of horses in pre-Cambrian rocks, that's the very bottom rock strata where you find fossils, would disprove evolution. More generally, any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory, yet not a single one has come to light. Oh. And of course, it won't come to light as long as their eyes are closed and they refuse to see. That's what I say. When you have all the evidence that we summarized just a few moments ago, we have to ask, how much more would a reasonable person need? Beyond that, it gets to the point where they're just not going to see it. But he continues saying, as Darwin recognized, a single geographic inconsistency would have nearly the same power of destruction. Unless you're just not deciding to accept it as true, no matter what the evidence. Stephen Stanley goes on to say, now these are his terms: demolish, disprove, destroy. As Dawkins of Oxford said, it would falsify the theory if these tracks were together, supposed to be 100 million years apart. And yet we demonstrate that they are together, examine them, even cutting pieces out and examining them under a microscope, that they're not falsified and they're not carved, and they're original impressions in the sediment. Well, if the geologic column then does not represent the accurate explanation of what we find, then how do we account for the fossil record? Those billions of fossil forms, billions of dead things that are found in rocks laid down by water all over the world, and never in the order in the textbooks. We find an average of a mile to a mile and a half of sedimentary rock containing billions and billions of dead things. Those who founded the sciences of geology and stratigraphy believe that this was done by a single catastrophic event, a great year-long catastrophe deluge involving many different depositional events. That's what a worldwide flood does. Many different depositional environments, but in one great year-long catastrophic event. Lots of water, takes a while to drain away. Nicholas Steno is known as the father of modern stratigraphy. I'm going to get that word yet. In the book I quoted from earlier by Dot and Batten, Evolution of the Earth, that I was taught from Indiana University, this is Dr. Don Patton, we read on page 24, concerning Steno, besides correctly interpreting fossils, Steno drew some even more important conclusions about the strata in which they occur. And notice he was a contemporary with Sir Isaac Newton. The result was formulation of basic principles for analysis of Earth history. Steno showed great insight. Steno's axioms proved the ultimate basis of practically all interpretations of Earth history, so their importance can hardly be overemphasized. Now, Steno was what's known as a flood geologist. He believed that this complete geologic record was produced as a result of a great catastrophic deluge, contemporary of Sir Isaac Newton. However, he wrote the rules that we use today to interpret the strata. Interesting. The rules don't change, so we can look at the rock strata and just look at it with eyes open. Anyone who studies stratigraphy has to memorize his 12 axioms. That's the way to interpret it. And he understood it well enough from his perception that he could write the rules 300 years ago that they still use today. And he still haven't really added to it. In other words, this concept, which presumes a worldwide flood, explains it fits, it works. A very important book was written almost 30 years ago by Whitcomb and Morris called The Genesis Flood. Building on Steno's work and the work of a number of others, they applied our modern knowledge of geology to this concept of explanation, a worldwide flood. John C. McCampbell, who is professor and head of the Department of Geology at the University of Southwestern Louisiana, a well-known geology school, wrote the foreword to this book. He is a uniformitarian evolutionary geologist and yet very fairly evaluated the ideas suggested in this book. So you don't have to throw out everything that we see that a worldwide flood creates because it's consistent. He says the facts of geology fit this explanation of a worldwide flood. He said, the authors have provided a very strong case for this as an explanation for the geologic record and a very serious challenge to the uniformitarian evolutionary explanation. Another way to say that more bluntly would be that my explanation doesn't work and yours does. So Dr. Campbell acknowledges that the facts fit the catastrophic flood view better. Notice the statement by David Raup, a professor of geology from the University of Chicago and curator of the museum with the largest number of fossils in America, the Field Museum of Natural History. He says contemporary geologists and paleontologists now generally accept catastrophe as a way of life, although they may avoid the word catastrophe. Interesting. It is almost comical to listen to them avoid that word because it tends to imply the catastrophe of the Bible that they don't like to talk about. Oh, that's philosophy. Well, nevertheless, he says that this is the way of life of paleontologists today, he said. The periods of relative quiet contribute only a small part of the record. The days are almost gone when the geologist looks at such a sequence and measures its thickness, estimates the total number of elapsed time, and then divides one by the other to compute the rate of deposition in centimeters per 1,000 years. The 19th century idea of uniformitarianism and gradualism still exists in popular treatments of geology. And in some museum exhibits and in lower level textbooks, one can hardly blame the creationists for having the idea that the conventional wisdom in geology is still a non-catastrophic one. David Raup says, here we go, likewise, notice a statement by Robert Dodd, whom we quoted above. Earlier, the author of the textbook that I was taught from Dr. Patton, in his presidential address to the Society of Economic Paleontologists and Mineralogists, he says, writing in GeoTimes, I hope I have convinced you that the sedimentary record is largely a record of episodic events rather than being uniformly continuous. Yay. Well, now the term episodic basically means catastrophe. Can't stand that word. Episodic is just one of those examples, as Ralph said, to avoid using that term. But we understand that he means an episodic as opposed to uniformly continuous explanation of the geologic record. And he says, my message is that episodicity, is the rule and not the exception. We need to shed those lingering subconscious constraints of old uniformitarian thinking, yet they still think that way. From these statements, you can see that there has been a change toward catastrophism in the thinking of the geologist. A very dramatic illustration is seen in John Horner's book, Digging Dinosaurs. He found thousands of dinosaur bones up in Montana, and he writes in this book, judging from the concentration of bones in various pits, there were 30 million fossil fragments in that area. At a conservative estimate, we have discovered the tomb of 10,000 dinosaurs. There was a flood, which Horner indicates was what placed the fossils in the way he observed them. There was no ordinary spring flood from one of the streams in the area, but a catastrophic inundation.